We're back with more election coverage updates. It's 10:11 a.m. Eastern Time now. I'm here with Matt Gertken, Vice President of Geopolitical Strategy at BCA Research. We're going to be talking about the latest updates, his outlook, and investment implications. Before we speak to our political expert, let's get your thoughts. What do you think is going on? Where would you be placing your investments and allocating your capital given what's happening right now in the political arena? Matt, welcome back to the show. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Hey, thanks a lot, David. Always a pleasure.
It's a roller coaster ride last night. First, Biden was taking the lead. Then it seemed like Trump had it in the bag. And now the tides have shifted back in Biden's favor as he took the lead in both Michigan and Wisconsin just earlier this morning. I'm looking at the latest electoral count. It's 224 for Biden, 213 for Trump. And looks like the Senate is still unconfirmed as to who is going to take that. Now, how are you reading all of this? When can we finally see a resolution, a definitive result? Can you give us a ballpark?
Well, the first thing is that the Senate, for the most part, has gone to the Republicans. And that's a big takeaway because remember, that means that you aren't going to see a tax increase in the U.S. over the next 2 years. So that's a major investment implication. But it also could have a downside, which is more near term. And that's simply because if Biden does end up capturing the presidency, then you have that antagonism between Democratic president and Republican Senate. And so you could have a longer delay and a smaller size of fiscal stimulus package over the next 3 to 6 months. That would generate some uncertainty, fiscal cliff type risk, and that would be negative near term, even though, over the 2-year period, it's great to have a situation where you're not seeing tariffs wildly thrown around like under Biden, but you're not seeing taxes go up like under a Republican Senate. So I would emphasize that to start off.
Okay, so if you're saying that the Senate is going to the Republicans, but the Democrats already have the House, it means we're going to get a divided government, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So does that mean more gridlocks in terms of passing bills such as fiscal stimulus?
Exactly. And that's my point, is that you can see the market reacting positively because there's a clear signal that taxes won't go up. And that is positive. But you also have this near term issue, which is that the Congress and the Trump administration never figured out how they were going to pass a new fiscal relief plan. And now that's unlikely to be done in the lame duck session if Biden wins. And so you get into January or February, and that's Biden's inaugural kind of battle, is to see if he can get the senators to do this. In the meantime, if the market loses faith, you could get a pretty substantial sell-off because of the need for fiscal stimulus, with the market trying to pressure essentially Senate Republicans to just capitulate and provide what the economy needs.
Okay, so you're right. The S&P 500 is up 2.45% as of 10:15 a.m. Now, that's not pricing in a definitive Trump re-election. What you're saying is it's pricing in no tax increase.
Well, it's leaning toward Trump because if Trump wins and the Senate is Republican, then they'll get a fiscal plan lickety split, in maybe November. And generally, you'd have a big fiscal push under that kind of configuration. You definitely wouldn't see the fiscal thrust contract by 7% of GDP, which is what's expected in the CBO's baseline projection for next year. So that's, if anything, maybe the way the market's leaning. And maybe even with Biden presidency, the market is seeing that point, which is that you don't really get tariff increases, but then with this Republican Senate, you don't get tax increases, which is both positive. But still, I think that the market could be in for a loop. First of all, we haven't settled these elections yet, so we still don't know who the president is. So we still don't know what the global trade war risk really is over the next 4 years. And the other thing is that we could have a contested election. These are razor thin margins. There will be disputes. There certainly will be disputes in Pennsylvania if it's as close as Michigan and Wisconsin. I don't know why it wouldn't be. And in that case, you do get a lot of uncertainty. That could be disruptive. I mean, we're not that far off from an electoral college tie. That would be if Trump only loses Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So it could be very dicey still, even though the market is happy right now.
Okay, yeah, we're going to talk about geopolitical risks and the global outlook and trade wars in just a bit. But let's go back to the electoral colleges here. What do each candidate, what do they need to win at this point?
Well, if you take the latest numbers, Biden is winning in both Wisconsin and Michigan, and so that means he's winning the election. The only exception to that would be if we get some kind of monkey wrench type stuff going on in the electoral college. Remember that you can have faithless electors in the electoral college who do not vote according to their state's popular outcome. So you could also have the Supreme Court intervene, or simply respond to cases brought forward by one of the parties, in this case, the Republicans, because of the hijinks that have gone on. And by hijinks, what I mean is, let's take Pennsylvania. There's a legitimate question about whether the deadline was November 3rd or not. And so both parties are trying to get the advantage of that. And so, point being, you can have a very tight election here if Trump wins Pennsylvania, but otherwise he's definitely finished. And even then, he should be finished based on what we know.
Okay, well, Trump came out with an announcement at around 2:30 a.m. Earlier this morning, basically declaring victory prematurely. And so I think some analysts would point to that as indication that the election might be contested. He won't accept a defeat even if that were to happen. Is there any legal weight in rejecting the results?
Well, that's the right question, because it doesn't matter what Trump says or what he tweets, but it does matter if there's legal weight to his disputes that are brought forward that go to state courts and that maybe eventually go to the Supreme Court. So it really depends. It depends on whether his team brings forward legitimate quarrels with the way that the votes were counted. And like I said, in Pennsylvania, you do have a legitimate question about the deadline for ballots, whether it's 3 days after or whether it's November 3rd. So that's the key point, because if it's just Trump with sour grapes tweeting, then eventually the constitutional system will simply overpower him. This isn't like a third world country, as much as it looks like one these days, where the president can just kind of hang around and stay in. At noon on January 20th, if he hasn't won through the constitutional mechanisms, he will be removed. He will be a squatter in the Oval Office, and he'll be taken out.
Okay, so let's set up your thesis now, Matt. Based on what's currently happening, who do you think has higher chances right now? Now, you mentioned that the markets may be pricing in a higher Trump victory, but we're looking at the college counts. Maybe Biden's taking the lead. What do you think?
Well, you did see the probabilities flip again, kind of in Biden's favor this morning, and that's because of Wisconsin and Michigan. And so the market must be celebrating either way. It's a relief just to know that we're nearing the end of this process. And of course, there are other factors at play. But I would say that again, it's too close to call right now, because a contested process gives Trump it gives him a lifeline. If President Trump is if he's losing the popular vote in these states, then it's over. We all know the answer. But if it enters into the Supreme Court, if it enters into the House of Representatives due to an electoral college tie or hung electoral college, well, then he's got a lifeline. It is likely that the Republicans will still control most of the states within the House of Representatives, so the state delegations to the House of Representatives. That's what would decide a tie outcome or a hung electoral college. And also, as we know, there's a 2-seat conservative leaning on the Supreme Court now, which means the court will interpret the law strictly, and that could end up favoring the president. So, I don't think we can simply say that because Biden is up by, 20 or 30 bips in one of these states that we have an answer yet.
Okay. Well, regardless of what happens from now on, Matt, can you safely say that Trump thus far has beat most analysts' expectations on his performance? I mean, has it fallen in line with your expectations, for example?
Well, yeah, it is in line with mine. I gave him a 45% chance of winning, and then last week I ultimately said the Senate would stay Republican. So this is in line with my forecast. I do think I was very out of consensus. The backdrop here, you had the economists at 5% chance of Trump winning. There were some very low probabilities thrown around, and those were adjusted over the course of last night, primarily because Trump won Florida, which shook things up. But that was to be expected. I mean, the Republicans did a great job in 2018 in Florida. So there were some, and remember also in the polls, he rallied very aggressively in the final weeks. And that's in the polling. So it's not as if the polls were wrong. The polls were showing that he was rallying, but some of the punditry did not really catch on to that late development. So I think it was a surprise. And in particular, in a year with a recession, a pandemic, and widespread social unrest, the Democrats should have had a Democratic sweep. And they didn't. In fact, they kind of flopped in the Senate. So I think they'll have to go back to bread and butter issues, which is how they win seats in the House. And they're going to have to think about that. And then meanwhile, Trump may not pull through. He, of course, made the election about a whole bunch of controversial things rather than hammering the economy, which the exit polls show the economy is the only reason he's still hanging in there.
Right. Yeah, I think that was my next question, which is why you think he's still hanging in there despite a poor economy, because a lot of people were saying that, a lot of people, unemployment is through the roof this year. People want change, but that's not really what the latest vote counts are showing.
Well, yeah, you would normally think they want change, but the crisis happened early in the year. And so there was time for a major rebound, with that third quarter GDP growth, 30% number that Trump was celebrating. There was this V-shaped recovery. You had a massive stimulus that fueled that. And so consumers, households were insulated from the full brunt of the shock. And then meanwhile, you also had a clear dichotomy that the Democrats didn't really do much to dispel, which was that, like Trump said, he's for closing the economy, I'm for opening the economy. And the exit polls show that the coronavirus was the third most important issue, not the second. It was the economy, racial inequality, and then the coronavirus. So basically, voters were not psyched about doing another lockdown. And Trump benefited from that. He benefited from a V-shaped recovery, but it still probably isn't enough for him to win the election, given those adverse circumstances and his generally low level of approval, throughout the 4-year period.
Let's talk about geopolitical risks going forward. Let's assume Trump wins. Do you think he'll continue the trade wars with China? And if we assume that Biden wins, do you think he'll, sort of ameliorate relationships with the Chinese?
I think Biden would start with a diplomatic reset or a new engagement with China, a new dialogue. I do think that's the case. That's different probably than Trump, although really Trump would, of course, start phase 2 trade negotiations. Trump is much more inclined to use sweeping unilateral tariffs. Biden, not so much. But I don't think Biden would repeal Trump's existing tariffs right away, because that would just be giving away leverage. That'd be kind of an early surrender. So, what's going on is that the U.S. is confronting China. It's been happening since 2008. It began under a Democratic administration. It's rooted in U.S. grand strategy. Doesn't really have much to do with Trump's tariffs. It can be executed differently, but it will continue as a policy under either of those. And so I would encourage investors to think about it not so much as a pro-China, anti-China issue. I think the Taiwan risk is extremely elevated under either of these presidencies. But what you would be looking at favorably is Europe. Biden is much more beneficial for Europe and the euro and euro investments than Trump is, because Trump could do a two-front trade war ultimately that would involve Europe as well. And so that's very negative for Europe. Whereas on China, you probably are going to see both administrations be pretty tough in the end.
Okay. So putting all this together, Matt, what are the implications for investors? Are you changing your stance on investments at all following today's news?
No, not really. I mean, we still would favor stocks over bonds. On a more tactical time frame, I've been long the Japanese yen. I had remained short the Chinese yuan, given that I had upgraded Trump to a 45% chance of winning. But if Biden does clinch it, I think there's a short-term period where the yuan will rally. Later, that'll be disappointed. But the initial move is going to be, hey, Biden's going for a diplomatic reset. So those are some thoughts. But I think the main takeaway here is that if Biden is in charge with the Republican Senate, we have a 3 to 6 month period of a fiscal cliff that's ongoing, brinkmanship. And that's going to be negative, even though we know taxes won't go up. And so I think there's still plenty of political uncertainty and risk to weigh on the market. And we're going to have a lot of volatility near term. And as I mentioned, you can still have a contested election. And Trump is still the president till January 20th. And he could do some things on the way out to try to lock in Biden on his key policies. So I think there's a lot of geopolitical risk. It'll take time to subside, even once we know the answer.
What about safe havens like Treasuries and gold?
Well, they would benefit. Now, treasuries, of course, I would emphasize stocks over bonds just because we're in this new reflationary era where the Fed is going to be ultra easy for many years. And when you do have the prospect of massive fiscal spending, almost no matter who is in power. And so I'm not, really wildly, I guess my thinking is very near term. Again, if any of those risks materialize, you could have the treasuries you could be kind of neutral, but it's not a very favorable or bullish view for treasuries. But gold and other safe havens, the yen, I do think those are looking attractive.
Okay. All right, Matt, thank you very much for your time today. I know it's a busy day for you. I appreciate you coming on.
No, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. We'll have much more for you. Stay tuned.